My family erased my existence for 8 entire years. They threw me out into the pouring November rain and treated me like a ghost. But everything changed the night they marched into the grand lobby of my luxury fashion and beauty brand in the heart of New York City. My father slammed a stack of legal documents onto the reception desk and demanded I sign over 50% of my company immediately, or he would call my building landlord and have me evicted by morning. What he did not know was that his threat was about to become the biggest mistake of his entire life. My name is Vivienne. I am 32 years old. I am the founder and creative director of a luxury fashion and beauty house called Noir Eclat. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth and tried to claim your success as their own. Trust me, you are going to want to hear exactly how I handled the ultimate betrayal. The clock above the sleek marble bar in the VIP lounge read exactly 8:15 on a Saturday evening. Manhattan was electric with energy. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of our flagship studio on Fifth Avenue, yellow cabs streamed past and the city skyline blazed against a deep indigo sky. Inside Noir Eclat, the private launch event for our newest fragrance collection was in full swing. Every seat in the event space was filled. Influential fashion editors, beauty industry investors, celebrity stylists, and social media personalities with millions of followers mingled beneath the glow of custom rose gold pendant lights. The air was rich with the scent of our new signature fragrance, a blend of dark amber, smoked jasmine, and sandalwood that had taken me 2 years to perfect with our master perfumer in Grasse, France. I was in the back studio reviewing the final packaging presentation before it went on display to the press, inspecting every detail of the hand-embossed glass bottles and the heavy matte black boxes tied with silk ribbon. This space was my sanctuary. I had built Noir Eclat from absolute zero, turning a tiny borrowed studio apartment into one of the most sought-after luxury brands in the American market. Every stitch, every formula, every campaign image had passed through my hands. Then the double doors, leading to the reception area, burst open. My head of client experience, pale and visibly shaking, rushed into the back studio. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She told me there was a serious situation at the front of the building and that she did not know what to do. I set down the glass bottle I was holding, straightened my jacket, and walked out into the main floor. The moment I stepped past the partition, my blood turned to ice. Standing directly in the center of my beautifully lit lobby, aggressively shouldering past the reception desk, was my father, Douglas. He was wearing his usual expensive-looking blazer, his face flushed with that familiar combination of entitlement and barely contained rage. Behind him stood my mother, Patricia. Then my younger sister, Serena, in a white satin slip dress, hanging off the arm of her husband, Marcus. And finally, hovering near the entrance with his hands in his pockets, looking deeply uncomfortable, was a man I did not recognize. He was young, perhaps late 20s, in a slim-cut charcoal suit, holding a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than most people's monthly rent. My steps slowed. A flood of memories hit me all at once. The last time I had seen my father, I was 24 years old. It was a wet, bitter November evening. I was standing on the front porch of our family home in Connecticut, shivering in a thin blouse, my eyes stinging from crying. He had just thrown 2 suitcases out the front door and told me to get off his property. My crime had been refusing to co-sign a personal loan so that my younger sister Serena could fund her third attempt at launching an online boutique, a boutique that had failed twice already and had cost my parents a combined $60,000. My father told me I was ungrateful. He told me I was selfish and that I had always thought I was better than the rest of the family. He told me I would never survive in the real world without his connections and his name behind me. They kept their word for 8 years. Not a single birthday call, not a text to ask if I was alive, not one message during the pandemic. When the entire world shut down, they erased me completely. Yet here they were standing in the middle of the empire I had built entirely without them. I took a long, slow breath, composed my expression into absolute professional calm, and walked toward the reception desk. Douglas did not flinch when he saw me. There was no hesitation, no flicker of remorse, no greeting. He simply looked me up and down with the same dismissive disdain he had always used to make me feel small. "Get whoever is in charge out here and get us into a private room immediately," he said, his voice carrying easily over the ambient music in the lobby. Several nearby guests turned their heads. I stopped directly in front of him and kept my voice low and perfectly steady. "I am in charge, Douglas. You do not have an invitation to this event, and you are disrupting my guests." He let out a short, condescending laugh. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and produced a thick envelope. He placed it flat on the reception desk with a loud, deliberate slap that made my receptionist flinch backward. "You think you are so clever, Vivienne," he said, leaning forward slightly to invade my personal space. "I know exactly who owns this building. I have been playing squash with Gerald Whitmore every Thursday morning for 15 years. He is one of my oldest friends in this city." He tapped the envelope with 2 fingers. "Here is how tonight is going to work. You are going to take these documents into a private room and you are going to sign them. What you are looking at is a legal agreement transferring 49% of Noir Eclat to your sister. Family is family, Vivienne. It is past time you started acting like it. If you refuse to cooperate tonight, I will call Gerald right now, and he will have your commercial lease terminated before this party of yours is even over. You will lose this space. You will lose everything you have built, and you will walk back out onto the street exactly where you belong." Before I could even formulate a response, Serena stepped forward. She looked around my lobby with a slow, theatrical sweep of her eyes. She took in the custom-brushed gold fixtures, the hand-painted accent walls, the towering floral installation at the center of the room, and the gleaming display cases filled with our fragrance collection. She wrinkled her nose. "It is very try-hard, isn't it?" she said to no one in particular, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the guests nearest to us. "Very loud, very desperate for attention. I expected something more refined from a luxury brand." She glanced at the display case beside the reception desk. "And these fragrances, I saw almost this exact same packaging concept from a Korean indie brand 2 years ago. Is this the inspiration, Vivienne? Or is it the actual reference?" Her husband, Marcus, placed a hand on the small of her back and stepped up beside her. Marcus was a broad-shouldered man who had made his money in mid-tier real estate development in New Jersey and had spent the subsequent 5 years convinced that made him an authority on everything. He was wearing a slim-cut navy suit and a watch that drew attention to itself in the way that watches worn by insecure men always do. "Vivienne," Marcus said, using the measured, patient tone of someone addressing a confused child. I have restructured 3 businesses in the past 4 years. I understand exactly what Noir Eclat needs right now to scale beyond what you've been able to achieve on your own. Serena has the creative vision. I have the operational infrastructure. And together we can take this brand into the kind of retail partnerships and licensing agreements you have not been able to secure. You focus on what you do best, the design side, the artistic pieces. Let the people who understand real business handle the strategy. I kept my expression completely neutral, but my eyes moved briefly to his watch. It was the kind of flashy piece a man buys to signal wealth he has not fully consolidated. I had read enough about Marcus over the past several months to know that 3 of his New Jersey development projects were currently stalled mid-construction, that his primary lender had placed 2 of his accounts on a performance review, and that his last big retail development in Newark had leased only 40% of its available floor space in the 18 months since opening. They were not here to help me grow. They were here because they were sinking, and they had decided that my company was their life raft. My mother, Patricia, stepped around from behind my father. She was wearing a pale blue wrap dress, and her expression was arranged into the specific kind of soft, wounded look she had perfected over decades of emotional manipulation. "Vivian, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have missed you so much. Your father is offering you an opportunity to bring this family back together. Serena is going through such a difficult time. She is trying to build something meaningful for herself and for her children when the time comes. Surely you have enough? Surely you can afford to be generous to the people who raised you." The sheer audacity of the framing was almost breathtaking. They were attempting to dress up a hostile corporate takeover in the language of maternal longing and family reconciliation. I looked at the young man in the charcoal suit who had said nothing and was hovering slightly behind the rest of the group. Douglas noticed my gaze and gestured toward him with a short flick of his hand. "This is Nathan," Douglas said. "He is a contracts attorney. He is here to notarize your signature tonight, so there are no delays." They had brought a lawyer. They had planned this. I let a very slow breath out through my nose. I looked at my receptionist, whose hand was hovering near the phone, ready to call security at my signal. A simpler version of me would have made that call immediately and had every single one of them escorted out the front door and onto Fifth Avenue. But as I stood there looking at their expectant, greedy faces, a different kind of plan began forming in my mind. Being removed from a lobby was not a sufficient consequence for what they had done. What they needed was to be dismantled completely and publicly by the woman they had written off as worthless. I gave my receptionist a composed smile. I reached over and gently moved her hand away from the phone. "That will not be necessary," I said quietly. I looked back at Douglas and gave him a perfectly polished smile. "You are right. We should discuss this privately." I turned to my receptionist. "Madeline, please escort my family to the Atelier suite on the 2nd floor. Give them full hospitality. Make sure they are comfortable." Douglas pulled his shoulders back and glanced at Marcus with an expression of barely concealed triumph. He thought he had won already. He thought the threat alone had been enough to crack me. Madeline led them through the main event floor toward the private elevator. I watched from the reception area as the shift in their posture became immediate and telling. Douglas moved through the crowd of press and industry guests, with his chin elevated as though he were already the co-owner of the company. Serena reached out and touched one of our display bottles without asking, turning it over in her hands with the proprietary ease of someone inspecting inventory that already belonged to her. The Atelier Suite was on the second floor of the building, accessible by private elevator. It was a large, beautifully appointed private room used for high-value client consultations and press exclusives. The walls were upholstered in deep charcoal velvet. The furniture was custom all-clean lines and rich materials. A long conference table of polished white oak sat at the center, under a chandelier of cascading crystal drops. It was an elegant, completely soundproofed room. Tonight it was a very carefully laid trap. They settled into the chairs with the ease of people who believed they had already won. Douglas placed his leather briefcase on the table and slid the contract envelope to the center. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands behind his head, with the theatrical satisfaction of a man who had just closed a deal. Nathan, the attorney, sat to one side, opening his briefcase and arranging his notarization materials on the table with quiet efficiency. Patricia moved immediately. She was already performing before the door had fully closed. She reached across the table toward my hand, but I redirected the motion smoothly by picking up a glass of water from the side credenza and placing it in front of her instead. Her face fell briefly before she reconstituted her expression into one of deep, aching sorrow. "Vivian," she began, her voice thick with rehearsed emotion, "you cannot possibly know how much pain the last 8 years have caused me. A mother is not supposed to be separated from her daughter. I have thought about you every single day. I have kept every magazine feature, every article. I have a whole folder on my phone. I showed everyone. I told everyone that was my daughter." She pressed her fingertips to her lips, her eyes shimmering. I looked at her steadily and said nothing. I had spent years in therapy carefully untangling what her particular brand of emotional performance had done to my nervous system. I had learned to recognize the difference between genuine feeling and tactical deployment of affect. What I was watching right now was the latter executed with the practiced precision of a woman who had been doing it for decades. "You have a folder," I said flatly. "Yes," she said, leaning forward. "Because I am proud of you, Vivian. I have always been proud of you. Your father and I both have. We simply had a difficult period, and things were said that should not have been said. But none of that erases how much we love you. We want to be part of your life again. That is truly what this is about. The business arrangement is simply a way of formalizing that reconnection. It makes us a unit again. It makes us permanent. It was a masterful performance. If I had not spent 4 years working through the specific damage that her particular flavor of manipulation had caused me, I might have found something in it to hold on to. Instead, I picked up the water pitcher from the credenza and moved around the table, filling each glass in turn without hurry. Serena stared at her glass like I had just placed a dead insect in front of her. "Still water," she said. "Vivian, we are here to discuss a significant business partnership. Do you not have sparkling? Do you not have anything from a proper mineral brand?" "Still water is what is on the credenza," I said pleasantly. Douglas slapped his hand on the table. "Enough with the water. We did not come up here to drink water. Bring us something worthy of the occasion. You run a luxury brand, act like it. Bring a bottle of champagne. Bring the best you have in the building." I paused, holding the crystal pitcher. "Of course," I said, meeting his eyes. "I will have someone bring up a bottle of our house champagne. It is a 2012 vintage Blanc de Blancs that we serve exclusively at private events. I will have it decanted for you immediately." Douglas nodded and leaned forward to Serena, saying something low and self-congratulatory. I turned my back on them and walked out of the atelier suite. As the door closed behind me, I walked directly to our event management station on the second-floor landing and opened a new billing account under the suite name. I entered every item that would be brought into that room tonight as a formal charge. The champagne alone was $420 a bottle at our internal event pricing. I had a feeling the tab was going to grow considerably before the evening was over. I took out my phone, opened the voice memo application, and pressed record. I slipped the phone into the inner pocket of my blazer and walked back into the suite. One of our event staff followed behind me with the champagne on a silver tray. She set it on the table with professional grace and stepped back. Douglas watched the champagne being poured with the expression of a man who had just received tribute. He lifted his glass and swirled it, not really looking at it, just performing the gesture. "Now," he said, setting the glass down, "let us stop wasting time. You understand the terms. 49% of Noir Eclat goes to Serena. Marcus will step in as Chief Operating Officer effective immediately. You keep your creative director title because frankly that is the only part of this business you are actually qualified to run. Nathan has prepared the full transfer documentation. All you need to do tonight is sign 3 places." Serena crossed her ankles and looked around the room with proprietary interest. "I also want to discuss the brand aesthetic," she said. "The direction you have been going is getting a little too niche, too editorial, too dark. We need to broaden the appeal significantly if we want to compete at the level I am envisioning. I have a whole mood board. I am thinking brighter color palette, more accessible price points on the skincare line, and are collaborating with some of the influencer names Marcus has relationships with in the tri-state area." Marcus nodded. "I have already had preliminary conversations with 2 retail chains about possible wholesale arrangements. Nothing confirmed, obviously, but the appetite is there if we can show them revised margin structures." I looked at Marcus carefully. He was speaking with the fluency of a man who had learned business vocabulary, but had never truly tested it against a real balance sheet. Preliminary conversations with retail chains. That could mean anything. It could mean he had mentioned Noir Eclat at a dinner party and received a polite nod from someone adjacent to the retail industry. "Which retail chains?" I asked, my voice mild and curious. Marcus straightened slightly. "I am not at liberty to share specifics at this stage," he said. "Confidentiality in the negotiation phase." "Of course," I said. I turned my attention to Douglas, who was growing impatient. His fingers were drumming a rapid, uneven rhythm on the table. "You are stalling," he said. "You have always done this. You overthink everything. You analyze until the moment passes and then you act surprised when you have nothing. Sign the papers, Vivienne. Stop making this harder than it needs to be." I sat down across from him and clasped my hands on the table. "Before we discuss the documents," I said, "I have one question." Douglas exhaled impatiently. "What?" "Where have you been for the last 8 years?" The room went very still. Patricia's performance dissolved instantly. She sat up straighter, her eyes sharpening. Serena looked at the table. Douglas' jaw tightened. "That is not relevant to this conversation," Douglas said. "I think it is," I said. "You walked into my building tonight, into my launch event, and presented me with legal documents demanding nearly half of my company. You brought an attorney. You made a threat about my lease. And yet in the 8 years since you changed the locks and told me to get off your property, not one of you reached out to ask whether I was alive. So yes, I think where you have been is extremely relevant. Patricia tried to interject. Vivienne, we were giving you space. You were not giving me space, I said, cutting through her sentence with a quiet, precise finality. You were punishing me for refusing to co-sign a loan for a business that had already failed twice. You were punishing me for having a boundary. And you maintained that punishment for 8 years because it was convenient, because I had nothing you needed yet. Douglas slammed his hand flat on the table. The champagne glasses trembled. You were disrespectful, he said, pointing at me. You acted like your sister's dreams were beneath you. You acted like you were the only one in this family who mattered. We gave you everything, and you gave us nothing in return. You gave me a childhood, I said, and then you stole something from me to pay for a destination bachelorette party in Cabo. The room went airless. Patricia's hands went still in her lap. Serena's eyes snapped to me. Douglas stared at me with an expression that told me he had not expected that particular sentence. I let the silence sit for a moment before I continued. I hired a financial forensic consultant 18 months ago, I said, keeping my voice completely conversational. I was attempting to trace a specific college savings account that my grandmother opened in my name when I was 7 years old. A $22,000 account that was supposed to cover the first 2 years of my design school tuition. I was 17 when she opened it. When I enrolled at Parsons at 20, I applied to access the funds and was told the account had been closed. Marcus shifted in his seat. It took my consultant about 3 weeks to locate the complete paper trail. I continued. The account was liquidated when I was 19. The funds were transferred in 2 installments to a joint family account. Approximately 6 weeks later, that family account was charged $11,000 to an event planning company in Los Angeles. Another $4,000 to a private villa rental in Cabo San Lucas. The remaining amount was distributed across a series of retail charges at department stores and a spa. Serena had gone very still in her white dress. That was the money for Serena's bachelorette trip, I said, and the beginning of her first boutique startup costs. My grandmother left that money specifically for my education. It was in my name. You used a family account to liquidate it without my signature because I was not yet on the paperwork, and Douglas was listed as the account trustee until my 20th birthday. I turned to Douglas directly. That is not a parenting decision. That is financial fraud. Patricia made a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp. We were going to replace it, she said, her voice fracturing. We always intended to replace it. Things became difficult financially, and it just... You never replaced it, I said. I enrolled at Parsons on a partial scholarship and 3 part-time jobs. I paid the remainder of my own tuition. I worked 60-hour weeks for 4 years while taking a full course load. Not once did either of you offer to help. Not once did you acknowledge what had been taken. Douglas had gone very quiet. A particular kind of quiet that I recognized from childhood. It was the quiet that preceded either an explosion or a pivot, and I watched him calculate which one to use. He chose the pivot. That money was for the family, he said, his voice dropping into a low, measured register that he clearly intended to sound authoritative. Everything in this family was for the family collectively. That is how a household functions. Your grandmother understood that. You were always treated exactly as well as your sister. Any financial decisions your mother and I made were made in the best interest of everyone. And yet, I said, Serena's 2 failed boutique ventures received a combined $60,000 in family investment over a 5-year period, while I received nothing after my scholarship. Not an offer of a loan, not $100 when my heating broke in January during my 2nd year. Nothing. Serena set her champagne flute down. Her expression had shifted away from the arrogant performance she had maintained since arriving and into something closer to genuine discomfort. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Marcus was watching me with a new and very careful attention. He had come into this room believing he was going to oversee a simple, if slightly contentious business transfer. He was beginning to realize that the landscape was significantly more complicated than Douglas had represented to him. Vivian, Patricia tried again. Please, we are here now. Can we not simply move forward? Serena needs this. She is going through a very hard time. Marcus's business has had some setbacks. They have a mortgage on a home that is beyond their current means. The baby they are trying to have is taking a physical and financial toll. We are not asking you to forget the past. We are asking you to be the bigger person. You have so much. Can you not afford a little generosity? There it was, stripped of all the corporate language about partnerships and strategic mergers. That was the actual sentence. You have so much. Can you not afford a little generosity? A little generosity, I repeated. You are asking me to transfer 49% of a company I built from nothing over 10 years. A company that is currently valued by our last external audit at approximately $14 million. You're describing $7 million in equity as a little generosity. Patricia blinked. Marcus cleared his throat. Douglas had resumed his drumming on the table. He had let Patricia's emotional approach run its course, and it had not produced a signature, so now he leaned forward with both elbows on the white oak table and looked at me with the hard, flat gaze of a man who was done with subtlety. Enough of the history lesson, he said. None of that matters tonight. What matters tonight is that Gerald Whitmore owns this building. He owns the entire block, Vivian. I have golfed with that man every single Thursday for 15 years. I was at his daughter's wedding. Our families have Thanksgiving together. He reached into his pocket and produced his phone, holding it up like a weapon. One phone call. That is all it takes. Gerald will terminate your commercial lease tonight. Without this location, without this Fifth Avenue address, your brand is nothing. You know it and I know it. This address is your entire identity. Lose it and you lose everything. So let us stop performing and let you pick up that pen and sign. Nathan, the attorney, quietly slid the document stack toward my side of the table and placed a pen on top. I looked at the pen. I looked at Douglas. I looked at the phone in his hand. I reached into my blazer and took out my own phone. I placed it face up on the center of the table. The voice recording was still running, the red indicator, pulsing quietly. Call him, I said. Douglas paused. If you are going to end my career tonight, I said, do it where everyone can hear. Put Gerald Whitmore on speakerphone and put the phone on the table right now. Douglas stared at me for a moment. Something flickered behind his eyes, but his ego was far too substantial to allow him to back down in front of Marcus and the attorney, so he accepted the challenge. He unlocked his screen and navigated to his contacts. He pressed the call button and placed the phone flat on the table. The ringtone filled the room. Patricia folded her hands in her lap. Serena watched the screen with wide eyes. Marcus was very still. Ring. I stood at the end of the table with my hands clasped in front of me. I watched the timer on my own recording device tick upward. Ring. Douglas sat forward confident. He had absolutely no doubt in his mind that Gerald Whitmore would take his call on a Saturday evening and cheerfully agree to terminate the lease of the most successful commercial tenant in his building as a personal favor. Ring. Then the ringing stopped. There was a brief shuffling sound, as though someone had picked up the phone in a hurry, followed by the background noise of what sounded like a dinner party. Voices, the gentle clink of crystal. Hello. A man's voice, older, slightly out of breath, with the faint impatience of someone who had been pulled from a conversation. Douglas's face split into a wide, practiced grin. He leaned over the phone. Gerald, it is Douglas. Douglas Hargrove. I am sorry to bother you on a Saturday evening, but I have a situation here in the city, and I need to call in a small favor. There was a brief pause on the line. Some background noise, shuffled and then quieted, as though the man had stepped away from the party. Douglas, the voice said. The warmth that Douglas had been projecting was not returned. The tone was measured, careful. What situation? I am sitting right now in a building you own on Fifth Avenue. The fashion brand on the 4th floor, Noir Eclat. The owner is my daughter, and she is being extraordinarily difficult about a very straightforward family business matter. He chuckled, attempting to make it sound like a minor domestic inconvenience. I just need you to send her a termination notice on her commercial lease. Nothing formal, just enough to help her understand the gravity of cooperating with her family. You know how these things go. Teach her a quick lesson. She respects authority, and she respects you. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Douglas glanced at the screen to confirm the call had not dropped. Douglas, the voice said finally, and the tone had changed. Whatever easy familiarity Douglas had been counting on was entirely absent now. The voice was careful and cold. Are you asking me to terminate a commercial lease on behalf of a personal grievance? It is a family matter, Gerald. Very simple. She just needs... Douglas, I am going to stop you there. The voice was firm, unhurried. I cannot terminate that lease. Douglas frowned. He leaned closer to the phone. Gerald, I understand it might feel like an unusual request, but this is between us. You have my full discretion. I will personally absorb any financial penalties associated with the early termination. Whatever it costs, I will cover it. We have known each other for 15 years. I cannot terminate that lease, Gerald repeated more slowly this time, as though speaking to someone who had not heard the first time, because I no longer own that building. The room became so quiet I could hear Patricia's breathing. Douglas went very still. What did you say? He asked. I sold the Fifth Avenue properties 8 months ago, Gerald said. There was something in his voice now that I could only describe as second-hand embarrassment for the man on the other end of the call. I consolidated my Manhattan commercial holdings as part of a broader portfolio restructuring. The entire block, including the building your daughter's studio occupies, was sold to a private investment group. I have had no ownership stake, no property management authority, and no legal standing over any of those leases since the transaction closed. I cannot help you, Douglas. I am sorry. Serena made a small involuntary sound. Marcus unclasped his hands from the table and placed them in his lap. He was staring at the phone with an expression of rapidly recalibrating assessment. Douglas was gripping the edge of the table. His knuckles were pale. "Which investment group?" he said, his voice stripped of all its earlier confidence. "Give me the name of the buyer, Gerald. If I can get the new owner on the phone tonight, I can still—" "It was a private acquisition," Gerald said. "An independent holding company. All cash offer, closed in under 3 weeks. Very clean, very fast. I do not have their direct contact information to hand, and frankly, Douglas, I am at a dinner party, and I would appreciate if you would not call this number again with requests of this nature. Good night." The line went dead. The disconnection tone hummed briefly across the speakerphone, and then the room fell into absolute silence. Douglas stared at the black screen of his phone on the table. He looked like a man who had just watched the ground beneath his feet reveal itself to be painted canvas over empty air. "Douglas," Patricia said, softly reaching toward his arm. He yanked his arm away from her touch. He sat very still for another moment, and I watched him go through the precise internal negotiation that men like him always go through when reality refuses to cooperate with their self-image. He was calculating how to pivot, how to reconstitute the authority he had just lost. He pulled his shoulders back. He cleared his throat. "This changes nothing," he said. The sheer audacity of the statement almost made me smile. "The building has a new owner," Douglas continued, his voice hardening back into its authoritative register. "And the new owner is a private investment firm. That means they are corporate. They are institutional. They do not care about one independent fashion brand the way Gerald did. Investment firms buy real estate to develop it. They buy it to demolish small tenants and bring in national chains with 10-year leases and guaranteed revenue. You are a liability to them, Vivienne. You are a small independent boutique brand occupying premium Fifth Avenue space that they could be renting to Chanel or Dior or any major international retailer for 3 times what you are paying." He pointed at me across the table. "You are going to get an eviction notice from the new owner anyway. The only question is whether you want to walk out of here tonight with 49% of your equity still in your hands, or whether you want to face a corporate eviction and a hostile merger in 6 months when you are desperate." Marcus immediately chimed in, nodding. "I know how these institutional real estate groups operate. If we go to them as a united front with a consolidated ownership structure and a proper corporate strategy, we have a much stronger negotiating position for lease renewal. Without that, you are walking into that conversation alone." "Exactly," Serena said, her voice recovering some of its earlier confidence. "You need us, Vivienne. You might not want to admit it, but you need a family around you right now. Marcus can navigate the corporate real estate side. I can help reposition the brand. We are not trying to take anything from you. We are trying to save you." I listened to all 3 of them reconstruct their argument from the rubble of the phone call. It was an impressive pivot. They had lost their primary weapon within 5 minutes of deploying it, and they had already developed a new approach before the echo of the disconnection tone had faded. But what they did not know, and what I had been waiting very patiently for the right moment to show them, was that the ground they were standing on had already been mine for 8 months. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer and produced a folded document. It was a single sheet of heavy cream paper with the embossed seal of the State of New York, Secretary of State's office printed in blue ink at the top. I unfolded it slowly and placed it flat on the center of the table, directly on top of the contract Douglas had been trying to make me sign all evening. "Read the entity name at the top," I said. Douglas frowned. He leaned forward and scanned the first line of the document. His frown deepened. He read it again. I watched his eyes move down to the ownership section. I watched the moment his brain caught up with what his eyes were telling him. He looked up at me. "Read the name of the managing member out loud," I said. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Allow me," I said, leaning forward slightly. "The sole managing member of Harrow and Stone Holdings, LLC, the private investment group that purchased the Fifth Avenue commercial block from Gerald Whitmore 8 months ago, is me. I am the managing partner. I hold 100% of the shares. There is no board. There is no institutional firm. There are no corporate sharks looking to replace me with a Chanel flagship." I looked directly into my father's eyes. "I am the new landlord, Douglas. I own the building we are sitting in right now. I own the commercial lease this entire studio operates under. When you threaten to call my landlord tonight and have my lease terminated as a personal favor, you are threatening to have me evict myself." The silence that followed was the most complete silence I had ever experienced in that room. Marcus's chair scraped backwards slightly, involuntarily, as though his body had registered a threat before his mind had processed it. Serena stared at the document, then at me, then back at the document. Her mouth was slightly open. Patricia pressed both hands over her mouth. Her eyes were very wide. Douglas sat completely motionless. His face had drained of its color. The aggressive red flush of entitlement that had sat on his cheeks since he arrived in the lobby was entirely gone, replaced by a waxy grey pallor that made him look much older than he had 20 minutes ago. I kept my voice very calm, very quiet. "You walked into my building tonight," I said. "You walked through my lobby. You sat in my private suite. You drank my champagne. You threatened my livelihood. You brought an attorney to notarize a document you had every intention of forcing me to sign under coercion." I paused. "And you built your entire plan on the assumption that Gerald Whitmore, a man you see at a golf club, would terminate the commercial lease of his most profitable Fifth Avenue tenant as a personal favor to you." Douglas was gripping the edge of the table with both hands now. "8 years ago," I continued, "you stood in the doorway of your Connecticut house in a warm sweater and told me to get off your property. You told me I would never survive without your name behind me. You told me I did not understand how the real world worked." I let that sit for a moment. I went out into the real world. I learned exactly how it works. I worked until my hands were raw. I saved every dollar I earned. I studied commercial real estate markets at 3 a.m. after 12-hour days at the studio. And when Gerald Whitmore mentioned quietly at an industry dinner that he was restructuring his Manhattan portfolio, I was the first person to put a clean all-cash offer on his Fifth Avenue block. I straightened up. I did not use a bank loan. I used capital I had built myself. I closed the deal in 21 days. I became your landlord months before you ever thought to walk in here tonight. Marcus stood up from his chair. His expression had completely transformed. The confident, patronizing advisor was gone. In his place was a man with rapidly darting eyes, recalculating every possible angle. "Vivienne," he said, and his voice was now carrying an unmistakable note of desperate friendliness. "I want to be very clear. I want you to know that I told Douglas from the beginning that this approach was wrong. I told him we should come to you respectfully, that we should ask, not demand. He drove the agenda tonight, not me. I was here as a support for Serena. That is all." He took a step around the table, toward my end. "But now that I understand the full picture, I actually think there is a genuinely exciting opportunity here. Not a forced transfer, a real partnership, voluntary, structured properly. You have the real estate, I have the development and operational experience, and together—" "Vivian, please," Serena said, suddenly cutting across Marcus. She had stood up from her chair. Her voice had lost every trace of its performative sophistication. What I was hearing now was stripped down and raw. "I know what we did was wrong. I know tonight was wrong, but I am drowning. I need you to understand that I am actually drowning." Her eyes were bright. "The house is in pre-foreclosure. Marcus has not made a mortgage payment in 4 months. His development company is being audited. I am 30 years old, and I have nothing that is actually mine. Everything I built was built on his money, and his money was never real." Her voice cracked. "You are my sister. You are the only person I know who built something real. I am not asking you to give me half of your company. I am just asking you to help me." The room was very still. I looked at my sister for a long moment. I thought about the girl who had grown up in the same house as me, who had been handed every opportunity, every resource, every excuse. I thought about the bachelorette trip to Cabo. I thought about the $22,000 that had been taken from my grandmother's gift to me and spent on a villa rental and a designer swimsuit haul and a private chef for a weekend that no one in that photo album had actually earned. I thought about myself at 20, sitting in a design studio at 2 a.m, calculating whether I could afford both groceries and my share of the heating bill that month. I felt something when I looked at Serena. But it was not guilt. It was not obligation. It was something quieter and more final than either of those things. It was the recognition that I could see her very clearly now. Not the golden child my parents had constructed. Not the polished, condescending woman who had walked into my lobby and insulted my brand 2 hours ago. Just a woman who had never been required to build anything on her own and was now experiencing for the first time the specific terror of having nothing solid beneath her feet. "You are not drowning because of me," I said. "You are drowning because every structure in your life was built by someone else, and those people either could not or would not maintain it." Serena's eyes spilled over. "I am not going to sign that document," I said. "I am not going to give you 49% of Noir Eclat. I am not going to offer Marcus a COO position. I am not going to give you a loan." I paused. "And I am not going to be the person who rescues you from the consequences of choices that were never mine to make." She covered her face with her hands. Across the table, Douglas was not looking at his youngest daughter. He was looking at me, and something had shifted in his expression. The aggression was gone. The calculation was gone. What was left was something that I had very rarely seen on my father's face in 32 years of knowing him. It looked very much like fear. Not fear of me exactly. Fear of the reality that the table had turned so completely, so finally, that he could no longer locate the exit. He had marched into my building, armed with a threat and a lawyer. He was leaving with neither. But Douglas Hargrove was not a man who accepted that quietly. He pushed himself back from the table. He stood. He straightened his blazer with a sharp, mechanical motion that I recognized as his way of physically reconstituting his authority when it had been stripped from him by external forces. "Keep it," he said. His voice was tight. "Keep the company. Keep the building. Keep all of it." He waved his hand in a gesture of dismissive contempt that was entirely unconvincing given the circumstances. I did not come here to beg. I came here to offer you a pathway back into this family, and you are too proud and too damaged to take it. That is your loss, Vivian, not ours. He picked up his briefcase. We are leaving, he said, not looking at Patricia or Serena. Patricia looked at him with an expression of fragile disbelief. She looked at me. She looked back at him. And then, because she had always, in every conflict, in every crisis, in every moment where choosing a side cost something real, chosen the path of least disruption, she stood, picked up her bag, and walked toward the door behind him. Serena did not move immediately. She stood beside her chair with her arms wrapped around herself, looking at the table. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, and she shrugged it off. Serena, Marcus said quietly. She finally looked up at me. Her eyes were red. Her expression was no longer performing anything. I am sorry about the money, she said. The money grandmother left you. I did not know it was for your education. They told me it was from a general family account. I looked at her for a moment. I believe that you believe that, I said. She nodded once, very slightly, and then turned and followed Marcus toward the door. Nathan, the attorney, had been so quiet for the last 40 minutes that I had nearly forgotten he was there. He gathered his documents back into his briefcase with brisk professional efficiency, his expression carefully neutral. He met my eyes briefly as he stood. Ms. Hargrove, he said. A small, almost imperceptible nod. Then he walked out. I was alone in the atelier suite. The room was very still. The chandelier cast its soft light over the disrupted table, the half-empty champagne flutes, the contract still sitting at the center of the white oak. My recording device was still running, the red light pulsing quietly. I stopped the recording. I folded the Harrow and Stone Holdings document and returned it to my pocket. Then I stood at the window for a moment, looking down at Fifth Avenue below. The evening traffic was still moving. The city was entirely indifferent to what had just happened in this room. A couple was walking a dog on the sidewalk below. A line of people was waiting outside the restaurant, 2 doors down. I had expected when this moment finally came to feel something enormous, something volcanic. I had carried the weight of that November night for 8 years. The rain on the porch, the 2 suitcases, my father's voice. You will never survive without my name behind you. What I felt instead was very clean, very simple, like a door that had been open a crack for 8 years, had finally quietly closed. I picked up my phone, walked to the door of the atelier suite, and pulled it open. The sounds of the launch event rose up from the floor below. Music, conversation, the gentle percussion of a party still in full beautiful swing. I straightened my jacket and walked toward the elevator. There was still an event to run. They were pressed to speak with editors to connect with a fragrance collection that had taken 2 years of my life to bring into existence and that deserved every remaining hour of this evening. My team was downstairs. My work was downstairs. My life was downstairs. I pressed the button for the first floor and watched the elevator doors close. The elevator doors opened onto the first floor, and the full warmth of the launch event wrapped around me immediately. The fragrance launch for our new Obscura collection was still running at full capacity. The event floor was lit beautifully, the rose gold pendant lights casting a warm, intimate glow over the assembled guests. A string quartet had replaced the ambient playlist for the evening's final hour, their music moving quietly beneath the hum of conversation. I could see our lead brand editor speaking with a journalist from Vogue near the main fragrance display. Two of our top retail buyers were examining the packaging of the limited edition collector's set near the far wall. One of our celebrity collaborators was being photographed in front of our installation by a photographer from an industry publication. Everything was exactly as it should have been. Celeste, my head of client experience, appeared at my elbow within seconds of my stepping off the elevator. She was a composed, elegant woman in her late 30s who had been with Noir Eclat since our second year of operation and who I trusted entirely. She looked at me carefully. "How did it go?" she said, keeping her voice below the level of the nearest conversation. "It went the way it needed to go," I said. "Is the suite being cleared?" "I sent 2 of the event staff up as soon as I saw them leave," she said. "I also pulled the full tab from the billing system. You should look at the total before we close it out." I nodded. "I will deal with that shortly. Right now, I need you to do something for me." "Of course." "The 4 people who came in through the main entrance approximately 90 minutes ago," I said. "The older man and woman, the younger woman in white, and her husband. They are still in the building. They came down in the elevator about 5 minutes before I did. I need to know where they are right now." Celeste touched her earpiece and spoke quietly. A moment later, she looked at me. "They are in the lobby. The older man is on his phone. The younger woman is speaking with her husband near the entrance. The older woman is sitting on the bench by the coat check." I smoothed my jacket. "Thank you. Please let Gregory and Finn know I may need them shortly." Gregory and Finn were our 2 evening security staff, both experienced, both unflappable. Celeste nodded once and moved away. I spent 20 minutes on the floor. I greeted the Vogue editor. I spoke with the retail buyers about our spring delivery schedule. I thanked the photographer. I moved through my own event the way I had trained myself to move fully present, fully composed, entirely at ease. I was not performing calm. The calm was real. Whatever adrenaline had sustained me through the confrontation in the atelier suite had not left me shaky or depleted. It had left me quiet, centered, like the specific stillness that follows the resolution of something that has been unresolved for a very long time. After 20 minutes, I made my way toward the lobby. They were still there. Douglas was standing near the window with his phone pressed to his ear, his back partly turned toward the room. His voice was low, and I could not hear the words, but I recognized the cadence. He was working the phone. He was trying to locate the executive leadership of Harrow and Stone Holdings, LLC. He was calling his network, his golf partners, his insurance clients, his country club acquaintances, trying to find a thread that would lead him to someone who could give him leverage over the company he had just discovered I owned. He did not yet fully understand that every thread he pulled would lead back to me. Patricia was sitting on the velvet bench near the coat check with her handbag in her lap and her eyes downcast. She looked smaller than she had upstairs. The architecture of her performance had collapsed completely, and what remained was a woman in her early 60s sitting in a lobby she did not belong in, waiting for a husband who was too proud to accept that his plan had failed. Serena and Marcus were standing near the entrance. They were not speaking to each other. Serena was looking at her phone with a hollow, unfocused expression. Marcus was staring at the street through the glass doors, with his jaw set and his hands in his pockets. The energy between them was not the energy of a couple processing a difficult evening together. It was the specific charged silence of 2 people who were each privately calculating what the other one's failure had cost them. I walked into the lobby. Douglas heard my footsteps and turned. He lowered his phone from his ear but did not put it away. He looked at me with an expression that was working very hard to remain unreadable but was not quite succeeding. "I thought you had an event to run," he said. "I do," I said. "But there is still the matter of your bill." Douglas frowned. "Our bill." "You consumed a significant amount of Noir Eclad's event hospitality this evening," I said. "The Atelier Suite carries a mandatory private room fee for non-event guests. The champagne was from our private collection. There were additional items brought up at your request. I have the full itemized account ready." Douglas stared at me. For a moment, I saw the old reflex flicker behind his eyes, the impulse to laugh it off, to wave his hand and suggest that the notion of him paying a bill in his daughter's establishment was too absurd to entertain. Then he seemed to remember with a visible effort that he was no longer in a position to project that particular kind of authority. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped. "Run it through. I will put it on the corporate card." I gestured toward the reception desk. Celeste was already standing there, the billing terminal open in front of her, and the itemized receipt printed and waiting. The four of them moved toward the desk. I stood to one side and watched Celeste present the receipt with impeccable professionalism. "The total for the Atelier Suite this evening," Celeste said, placing the printed sheet on the desk in front of Douglas, "including the private room fee, the 2012 Blanc de Blanc vintage, the additional mineral water service, the charcuterie board that was brought up at the request of Mrs. Hargrove, and the standard event hospitality surcharge comes to $3,240. Patricia made a quiet sound. Marcus looked at the receipt. Then he looked at Serena. Then he looked at the floor. Serena crossed her arms. Douglas pulled his wallet from his inside pocket with the deliberate, unhurried motion of a man who intended to demonstrate that $3,000 was an entirely inconsequential sum to him. He produced a heavy titanium corporate card and placed it on the desk. Celeste ran the card with smooth efficiency. The terminal processed for several seconds, then it produced a short, sharp tone. Celeste looked at the screen. Her expression did not change. She had been briefed on the possibility of this outcome, and she handled it exactly as I had trusted her to. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice perfectly pleasant. "The card has been declined. Would you like to try an alternative?" Douglas's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the edge of the desk. "Run it again," he said. "There is no reason for it to decline. The limit on that account is substantial." Celeste ran it again. The same tone, the same result. "I apologize," she said. "It seems to be declining again. Perhaps a different card." The color that returned to Douglas's face was not the flush of confidence he had worn when he arrived. It was something darker and more desperate. He reached back into his wallet and produced a second card, a personal visa. Celeste ran it, declined. A third card, an American Express Gold, declined. Douglas stood very still at the desk. He was gripping his wallet with both hands now. Behind him, Patricia had stood up from the bench and was hovering a few feet back, watching her husband's hands. "There is clearly a technical issue with your system," Douglas said. His voice was flat and very controlled, the way voices become when the person speaking them is concentrating very hard on not showing what is happening inside them. "I understand," Celeste said. "Our terminal is fully operational and connected to our central payment processor. We have not had any technical issues this evening. Is there another payment method you would like to try?" Douglas turned to Marcus. It was a small turn, almost casual. The kind of motion a man makes when he is delegating a minor administrative task, not the kind of motion a man makes when he is quietly asking someone to bail him out of a situation he cannot handle himself. But I had been watching Douglas Hargrove perform authority for 32 years, and I knew the difference. Marcus saw it too, and for a moment, the two men looked at each other across the 3 feet of lobby floor between them, with the specific understanding of two people who have reached the outer limits of the collaborative fiction they have been maintaining. Marcus, Douglas said, just the name, no elaboration. Marcus let out a slow breath through his nose. He reached into his jacket. He produced his own wallet. He opened it, and I watched him look at its contents for a moment before he extracted a card. Celeste ran it. Declined. Marcus's jaw tightened. He took out a second card. Ran it. Declined. He replaced both cards in his wallet and put it back in his pocket. He did not say anything. He did not look at Serena. He looked at the middle distance somewhere to the left of the reception desk with the expression of a man who has simply run out of moves. The lobby was very quiet. The ambient sounds of the event filtered softly through from the main floor. Music. Conversation. The sound of a successful evening entirely indifferent to the crisis occurring 20 feet away from it. Serena stepped forward. She was holding her phone in one hand, and her expression was composed in the particular way that people compose themselves when they are trying to get through the next 60 seconds without coming apart entirely. "I have cash," she said. Her voice was very quiet. Everyone looked at her. She opened her clutch bag and counted out what she had. $340 in bills. She placed it on the desk with a precision that felt like the last careful action of someone trying very hard to retain a single square inch of dignity. "I know it's not enough," she said. She was not looking at me. "No," I said. "It is not." The lobby went quiet again. I let the silence extend for a moment, long enough for all of them to understand fully and without any remaining ambiguity exactly where they stood. Douglas Hargrove, who had arrived in this building 2 hours ago with a lawyer and a threat, and the absolute conviction that his connections and his name would be sufficient to pry 50% of my company from my hands, could not cover a $3,000 event bill. His corporate cards had been declined. His son-in-law's cards had been declined. His daughter had $340 in cash in her evening bag. The emperor had been standing in front of us this entire time with no clothes. And now everyone in the lobby could see it. I looked at Celeste. "Please hold the bill," I said. "I will handle it directly." Celeste nodded and stepped back from the terminal. I looked at Douglas. "I am going to offer you a choice," I said. "Not out of generosity, not out of any remaining familial obligation. I am offering you a choice because what happens next will be determined entirely by which option you select." Douglas met my eyes. He was very still. "Option 1, I said. "You provide me with a signed written acknowledgement of the outstanding balance tonight with a legally binding commitment to remit payment within 14 days. I will accept that acknowledgement in lieu of immediate payment, and you will be free to leave my property." Option 2, I continued, keeping my voice even and clear. "You decline to sign the acknowledgement, in which case I will contact the NYPD right now and report a theft of services. In the state of New York, consuming services at an establishment without the means or intention to pay constitutes a criminal offense. A bill of this size elevates it to a misdemeanor, with potential for escalation given the circumstances. I have a recording of the entire evening, including your statements in the Atelier suite, that I will be happy to provide to responding officers as context. Patricia made a soft, anguished sound. Serena did not move. Marcus was staring at the floor. Douglas looked at me for a very long time. I watched him process the full landscape of his situation. He had walked in here tonight as a patriarch, a power broker, a man with connections and leverage and the authority of a father who had come to collect what he was owed. He was leaving as a man whose corporate cards had been declined in public, whose son-in-law was facing bankruptcy, whose daughter was holding $340 in a clutch bag, and whose other daughter owned the building he was standing in. He was also leaving as a man who had made threats on a live recording that his own attorney would almost certainly advise him he could not afford to have presented to a court. He held out his hand. "Give me the acknowledgement," he said. I produced a single sheet of noir éclat, branded notepaper from the desk drawer. I wrote out the terms of the acknowledgement myself clearly and simply. Outstanding balance of $3,240, due within 14 days in full. I placed it on the desk in front of him with a pen. Douglas picked up the pen. He held it over the paper for a moment, and then with the deliberate, resigned motion of a man signing something that would cost him far more than money, he signed his name. I took the paper back. I folded it and placed it in my jacket pocket. "You can leave now," I said. Douglas straightened his blazer. He picked up his briefcase. He did not look at Patricia. He walked toward the glass entrance doors and pushed through them without turning back. Patricia hesitated for a moment. She looked at me with an expression that I could not entirely read and that I did not try to. Then she gathered her bag and followed him out. Marcus put a hand, briefly, on Serena's back. She stepped away from it and walked to the door herself. Marcus followed. I watched through the glass as the four of them emerged onto Fifth Avenue. Douglas immediately flagged a cab. He did not hold the door for Patricia. He got in, and the cab moved away from the curb before Marcus and Serena had even reached the sidewalk. Patricia stood on the pavement, watching the cab disappear into traffic with her bag held against her chest and her face very still. The glass doors settled closed. The lobby was quiet. Celeste appeared at my shoulder. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," I said, and I meant it with a completeness that surprised even me. "Go back to the event. Tell the string quartet to play one more set. The journalists from WWD and L are still here, and I want to make sure they have everything they need before they leave." Celeste smiled briefly. "Of course." She paused. "The atelier suite has been cleared and reset. By the way, good as new." "Thank you, Celeste." She moved away, and I stood alone in the lobby for a moment longer. Outside, the city continued its indifferent, relentless motion. Taxis, pedestrians, the distant sound of a horn several blocks away. Fifth Avenue did not know or care what had just happened behind these glass doors. The building stood exactly as it had before they arrived. The marble floors under my feet were the same floors they had been at 6 o'clock. My name was on the deed of this building. My name was on the commercial lease of every studio and showroom and office space in it. That had not changed in the last 2 hours. It had simply been revealed. I turned and walked back into my event. 3 weeks after the evening of the Noir Éclat fragrance launch, I was sitting at my desk on the 3rd floor of the Fifth Avenue building when my attorney sent me a document that required my review and signature. It was a formal demand letter from a law firm I did not recognize, addressed to Harrow and Stone Holdings, LLC, citing my father, Douglas Hargrove, as the aggrieved party. The letter alleged that the rent acknowledgement he had signed in my lobby was signed under duress, that I had used my position as his landlord to coerce him, and that the bill itself had been improperly inflated and fraudulently represented. It demanded the acknowledgement be voided and threatened a civil suit. I read the letter twice. Then I called my attorney, a compact and ruthlessly efficient woman named Adrienne, who had been handling my corporate and real estate legal affairs for 4 years and who treated hostile correspondence the way other people treated mildly irritating weather. He filed a coercion claim, I said. I saw it, Adrienne said. Do you want the short version or the detailed version? Short. It has no legs. The recording you provided me covers the entire evening in the suite and the lobby interaction. You offered him a voluntary choice between 2 options in the presence of a witness. He signed the acknowledgement without protest. His attorney has to know this. My read is that this letter is a pressure tactic, not a genuine legal strategy. They are hoping you will settle the bill or void the document rather than engage in a prolonged dispute. I am not going to void the document, I said. I assumed not, Adrienne said. I will prepare the response. In the meantime, there is something else you should look at. My real estate associate flagged something during routine monitoring of the Hargrove commercial lease at Oak Tower. She paused briefly. His firm is on a month-to-month tenancy, and they are currently 60 days behind on their rent. The management company at Oak Tower sent a formal notice of arrears last week. If he does not cure the default within 30 days, they will initiate formal eviction proceedings. I was quiet for a moment. Oak Tower was a commercial building on Park Avenue, where Douglas's insurance brokerage had occupied the 9th floor for the better part of a decade. It was a prestigious address. It was in many ways the cornerstone of the image he had spent his career constructing. His letterhead carried the Oak Tower address, his business cards, his email signature. Who manages Oak Tower? I asked. Centerfield Properties, Adrienne said. Privately held. They have been the management company for about 3 years. Standard institutional setup. I turned to my computer and opened a browser. I searched Centerfield Properties. I found their website in 30 seconds. I read through it carefully. Then I sat back in my chair. Adrienne, I said, pull the full ownership structure for Centerfield Properties. I want the registered principals, the corporate filing history, and any parent-entity relationships. That will take a few hours. That is fine, I said. Send me what you have when it is ready. I closed the browser and looked out the window at the street below. A delivery truck was double-parked on the corner, hazard lights blinking. A woman in a long coat was walking a pair of greyhounds, the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning in Manhattan. I thought about Douglas standing in my lobby with his titanium corporate card, pressing it into the terminal with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once in his adult life genuinely worried about whether a card would go through. I thought about what it must have felt like when it declined, not with satisfaction exactly, something more complex. The recognition that the architecture of a person's self-image is in the end only as solid as the financial structures beneath it, and that those structures, no matter how polished the exterior, can be hollowed out from the inside for years before anyone on the outside can see it. Adrienne's research came back 4 hours later. I read through it at my desk with a cup of green tea and no particular urgency. Centerfield Properties. It turned out was a subsidiary. Its parent company was a holding entity called Greymont Capital Group. Greymont Capital Group had been incorporated in Delaware 18 months ago. It had 3 registered principals. 2 of them were professional real estate attorneys who appeared in dozens of similar corporate structures across the city. The third was a name I recognized. Her name was Josephine Harrow. Josephine Harrow was 63 years old. She was a retired commercial real estate developer who had spent 30 years building and selling midtown office properties. She had been profiled in Commercial Property Executive 3 times. She sat on 2 industry boards. She was deeply respected in the sector. She was also, for the past 2 years, my silent partner in Harrow and Stone Holdings, LLC, and the woman who had first suggested over lunch at her home in the West Village 18 months ago that Gerald Whitmore's 5th Avenue block might be worth approaching. Josephine owned the management company that was about to evict my father from his office. I called her. She answered on the second ring. I could hear opera playing faintly in the background. She listened to me explain what I had found without interrupting. When I finished, there was a brief, thoughtful silence on her end. Small city on, she said. Remarkably, I said. What would you like to do? She asked. There was no presumption in the question. She was asking in the same way she had always asked, clearly and without agenda. Whatever I decided, she would support. I thought about it for a moment. Nothing unusual, I said. Proceed as you would with any other tenant in default. If he cures the arrears within the notice period, the tenancy continues on its current terms. If he does not initiate the standard eviction process. No interventions either direction, she confirmed. No interventions, I said. He built his career on the premise that the rules other people live by do not fully apply to him. I would like him to experience what it feels like when they do. Josephine was quiet for a moment. Then, with the dry, measured warmth that was entirely characteristic of her, she said, You know, I have been in this industry for 30 years, and the one thing I have learned with absolute certainty is that the people who build their reputations on the appearance of wealth rather than the reality of it are always eventually found out by a lease. I smiled. Thank you, Josephine. Of course, she said. Come to dinner sometime soon. Bring that fragrance you launched last month, the one with the smoked jasmine. I want a bottle. I told her I would bring 2. Douglas did not cure the arrears. He made a partial payment in the 4th week, enough to suggest intention, but not enough to satisfy the legal threshold. Centerfield Properties, following standard commercial tenancy procedure, initiated formal eviction proceedings at the 31-day mark. I learned about the outcome 3 weeks after that, not from Adrienne, but from an item in a commercial real estate industry newsletter that Celeste forwarded to me without comment. The item was brief. It noted that the insurance brokerage firm Hargrove and Associates had vacated its long-held offices at Oak Tower following a commercial tenancy dispute and had relocated to an address in White Plains, New York. White Plains. Not the suburbs in a premium sense. White Plains, in the sense of a city 40 minutes north of Manhattan, where commercial rents were a fraction of midtown pricing, and where the client base that Douglas had spent his career cultivating would require a commute they had no particular reason to make. I read the item once. Then I closed the newsletter and went back to the quarterly reports I had been reviewing before Celeste's email arrived. I did not feel triumph. I want to be precise about that because it is important. What I felt was a quiet, factual kind of completion. A closed account. The specific piece that comes not from watching someone fall, but from finally, fully releasing the weight of caring whether they do. The situation with Serena resolved itself without any involvement from me, which is exactly how it needed to resolve. Adrian informed me 6 weeks after the launch event that the federal investigation into Marcus's development company had expanded in scope. 3 additional investors had filed civil suits. The forensic accounting review of his corporate accounts had revealed a pattern of commingled funds that his attorney was apparently working very hard to characterize as administrative oversight rather than deliberate fraud. Serena had retained her own attorney and had filed for legal separation. The separation filing identified her as having no independent assets, no personal income, and no professional history outside of a series of short-lived business ventures that had generated no verifiable revenue. The luxury home they had shared was confirmed to be in foreclosure. The combined debt load carried in both their names, credit cards, the home equity line, the personal loans Marcus had taken in her name with her signature, was extensive. She was, as she had said, in the atelier suite, genuinely drowning. I thought about that conversation for a long time. I am not a person who finds it simple to remain unmoved by another person's genuine suffering. Whatever Serena had taken from me, whatever she had participated in, either through active choice or through the passive selfishness of someone who never bothered to ask where her resources were coming from, she was still a woman in her early 30s who was pregnant alone and structurally destitute in a way that had not been entirely of her own making. Marcus had lied to her. Douglas had modeled an entire philosophy of entitlement and financial fiction that she had absorbed without the tools to interrogate it. That did not make her innocent, but it made her comprehensible in a way that prevented me from feeling nothing. I called my attorney and instructed her to make a single specific arrangement. I had a relationship with a non-profit organization called Meridian Bridge, which provided housing support, financial literacy education, and legal advocacy for women leaving economically abusive relationships. I had been a quiet donor for 3 years. I asked Adrian to contact Meridian Bridge on my behalf and arrange for a complimentary enrollment package to be made available to Serena, covering 3 months of their transitional housing assistance program and access to their legal advocacy team. The arrangement was made anonymously. Serena would receive the offer as a routine outreach from the organization with no reference to me or to Noir Eclat. Whether she accepted was entirely her choice. I did not tell anyone I had made the arrangement. Not Celeste, not Josephine, not my therapist, not the small group of close friends who knew the broad strokes of my family history. I made it because it felt like the correct thing to do, and for no other reason. Not to demonstrate magnanimity, not to generate a clean ending to the story, simply because she was in a position where a specific kind of help existed, and I was in a position to make it available, and the reasons she was in that position were not simple enough to justify withholding it. My mother called me on a Thursday morning in the 8th week after the launch event. I was in the studio reviewing a sample run of our new skincare packaging when my personal phone showed her name on the screen. I looked at it for a moment. Then I set down the packaging sample and stepped away from the workbench and answered. "Hello, Patricia," I said. There was a brief pause on her end, as though she had expected the call to go to voicemail and had not fully prepared for the reality of me answering. "Vivian," she said. Her voice was different from the voice she had used in the atelier suite. The performance was gone. What I heard was something more unguarded and more tired. "I did not expect you to pick up." I almost didn't, I said honestly. Another pause. I wanted to call for 2 reasons, she said. The first is to apologize. Not the kind of apology I gave in that room, because I know that was not a real apology. That was a performance. I know you know the difference, and I know I owe you more than that. She stopped. I could hear her gathering herself. I am sorry for what happened with your grandmother's account. I knew about it. I told myself it was Douglas's decision and not mine to interfere with, and I understand now that that is not an adequate position to take. I was complicit. I benefited from it. And then I spent 8 years not acknowledging it, because acknowledging it would have required me to acknowledge everything else. She paused again. I am also sorry for the night he threw you out. I was standing in the hallway. You know I was standing there, and I did nothing. I have thought about that night more times than I can count, and there is no version of it where my behavior was acceptable. I stood very still beside the workbench. I had imagined versions of this phone call many times over the past 8 years. In some of them, I had responded with the full articulate weight of everything I had needed to say. In others, I had said nothing and simply ended the call. In the version I had imagined most frequently during the first 2 or 3 years, after my father changed the locks, I had cried. I did not cry. I hear you, I said. She waited. I am not going to tell you the apology is accepted, I continued, not because I want to punish you, but because I think saying that would be imprecise, and I do not want to be imprecise with you about this. What I can tell you is that I heard what you said and I am not dismissing it. That is fair, she said quietly. You said there were 2 reasons you called, I said. Yes. She cleared her throat slightly. The second reason is to tell you something I think you should know not to ask anything of you and not to use as leverage or manipulation, just because I think you deserve to know it. She paused. Serena accepted the offer from the housing organization. Meridian Bridge. She moved into their transitional program last week. She did not tell Douglas or me that she was going, she just went. I found out through her attorney. Another pause. I do not know how she found out about them or how she qualified for their program so quickly, but she seems to be in a safe and supportive environment, and I thought you would want to know that. I was quiet for a moment. Thank you for telling me, I said. After the call ended, I stood by the workbench for a while. The studio around me was familiar and solid and entirely mine. The afternoon light came through the high windows and fell across the packaging samples and the material swatches and the fragrance bottles in their development trays. I had built all of this, not from resources that were given to me, not from connections I had inherited or a name that carried weight in rooms before I entered them. From nothing except a set of ideas, a capacity for sustained hard work, and the absolute refusal to accept that the people who had told me I was not enough were correct. The irony was not lost on me that the same qualities that had made me dispensable to my family were exactly the qualities that had made everything I now owned possible. Being cut off had removed me from a system of learned helplessness and conditional belonging that would have constrained me in ways I probably would not have been able to fully see from inside it. When you are the scapegoat, you do not get the soft landings, you do not get the bailouts or the co-signed loans or the startup capital with flexible repayment terms. What you get is the education of necessity. The specific, unforgiving clarity of knowing that no one is coming to save you which means learning faster and more thoroughly than you otherwise would exactly how to save yourself. 6 months after the fragrance launch, Noir Eclat was featured on the cover of Harper's Bazaar. It was the September issue. The cover image was a photograph of our Obscura fragrance bottle, resting on an expanse of dark silk lit from below the glass, casting prismatic light across the fabric. The headline read, "The New Language of Luxury, How Noir Eclat Redefined What It Means to Build a Beauty Empire from the Ground Up." The feature was 4 pages. It covered the brand's origins, our design philosophy, our approach to sustainable luxury sourcing, and our expansion plans for the following year. There was a photograph of me in my studio, standing at the workbench in a white shirt with my sleeves rolled to the elbows, surrounded by fragrance development materials. I looked according to Celeste, who saw the final image before it went to print, like someone who had been exactly where she was supposed to be for a very long time. I kept a copy of the issue in my office, not on the desk, on the shelf above the filing cabinet. Spine out the way, you keep things that matter enough to store properly, but that you do not need to display. The week the issue hit newsstands, I received a text message from a number I did not have saved. It was 3 words. I saw it. I stared at the message for a moment. Then I looked at the area code. It was a Connecticut number. I did not respond. I did not need to. The message was not asking for anything. It was simply a statement of fact from someone who had told themselves for 8 years that they were proud of me, and who was now possibly for the first time in a position where that statement had become genuinely true. I set my phone face down on the desk and went back to work. There is a particular kind of question that people ask when they learn that someone has been estranged from their family and has subsequently built something of significant value on their own. The question takes different forms, but it always comes down to the same essential thing. Do you not wish they could see what you have done? I understand why people ask it. The assumption embedded in the question is that the primary motivation for achievement, when it emerges from a context of rejection, must be the desire for the rejecting party's acknowledgement. That what you are building is at its core a proof of worthiness addressed to the people who told you that you were not worthy. That was true for me for a period of time. I will not pretend otherwise. In the first 3 or 4 years after my father changed the locks, the engine running beneath the surface of my working life had a component that I can only describe as the desire to be seen, to have the people who had written me off encounter the evidence of what they had thrown away and understand the full magnitude of their miscalculation. But that engine is a poor long-term fuel source. It requires constant maintenance, and it produces alongside the driving force a low-grade continuous pain that becomes increasingly difficult to sustain as the years accumulate. At some point, and I cannot tell you exactly when it happened, because it did not happen in a single moment, the fuel changed. I stopped building Noir Eclat in order to be seen. I started building it because I loved the work, because the specific problem of translating an emotion or a memory or a quality of light into a physical object that could be held and worn and carried on a person's skin was the most interesting problem I had ever encountered. Because the creative act of building something from nothing, the daily confrontation with the question of what this should be and how it should exist in the world, was the most fully alive I had ever felt. When that shift happened, the work became something different. It became mine in a way that was separate from what it represented or what it proved. It was no longer a message addressed to my family. It was simply the thing I was made to do, And then when my family arrived at my door, after 8 years of silence, they were not arriving at the end of a long journey of proof. They were arriving at the threshold of something that had nothing to do with them. That is the part that is hardest to explain and perhaps most important to understand. They did not fail to take my empire, because I was cleverer than them, though the evening did require a certain strategic composure. They failed because the empire was never about them in the first place. It was not built for their approval. It was not built in defiance of their rejection. By the time they walked through my doors, it had been built entirely for its own reasons, and that meant it was rooted in a kind of soil that their tools could not reach. They had come expecting to find a daughter, someone whose fundamental orientation was still organized around their presence, their judgment, their power to bestow or withhold belonging. Someone for whom the offer of re-entry into the family unit, however transactional, however manipulative, would carry enough gravitational pull to loosen her grip on the things she had built. They found a landlord instead. Noir Éclat opened its second flagship location in Paris the following spring. The building was a 19th century hotel, particulier in the 8th arrondissement, that had been a luxury jewelry atelier for 60 years before the family that owned it decided to sell. We acquired it through Harrow & Stone's European subsidiary, which Josephine and I had established the previous autumn. The renovation took 8 months. We preserved the original gilded ceilings and the herringbone oak floors, and the tall arched windows that looked out onto a quiet interior courtyard. The opening was attended by editors and industry figures who had been following the brand since our early years. There was champagne that cost considerably more than the bottle we had served in the Atelier suite on the night of the fragrance launch, and considerably more than $3,240 of it was consumed. I stood in the courtyard at the end of the evening after most of the guests had moved inside and looked up at the building. The lights from the reception inside fell through the high windows and illuminated the stone facade. The courtyard was quiet and cold and smelled faintly of the white flowers that had been arranged along its perimeter. I thought about the 2 suitcases on the porch in Connecticut. I thought about the studio apartment with the broken heating, about the 60-hour weeks and the scholarship forms and the 3 part-time jobs running simultaneously with a full course load, about the first collection I showed in a rented basement gallery space in Brooklyn with folding chairs and a cheese plate and 30 people, half of whom I had personally called to ask to come. I thought about the night in my 3rd year of operating the brand, when I was lying awake at 2 a.m, running cash flow projections in my head and trying to determine whether I could make payroll for my first 2 employees without drawing down the small emergency reserve I had set aside for production delays, and deciding that I could by the margin of a few $100s, and then lying there in the dark, feeling something that was not quite certainty, but was the closest thing to it that I had encountered since leaving Connecticut. A feeling that I was going to be all right. Not because I had support, not because someone was backing me, because I had looked at every number, considered every variable, made every calculation I was capable of making, and the numbers said that if I continued doing what I was doing with the discipline I had been applying, it was going to hold together. I had learned in the specific school of having nothing how to trust the architecture I built. That was the thing my family could not take. Not the building, not the brand, not the lease agreements, or the equity, or the fragrance formulas. The architecture of the self that had been built in the years when they were not watching and were not present and did not care. That was the part that was unstealable. That was the part they had not known to look for when they arrived at my door with their contract and their lawyer and their threat about the landlord. The door opened behind me, and Celeste stepped out into the courtyard with 2 glasses of champagne. "The speeches are starting," she said. "Give me 2 more minutes," I said. She handed me one of the glasses and stood beside me, and for a moment we both looked up at the building in companionable silence. "You should be proud," she said. "I am," I said, and it was simple and true and entirely sufficient. I am speaking now to anyone who has been told by someone whose approval they needed and did not receive that they were not enough, not smart enough, not connected enough, not the right kind of person to build the kind of life they wanted to build. I am speaking to anyone who was cut out of a family, a company, a community, a relationship, not because they had failed, but because they had refused to make themselves smaller to accommodate someone else's need for their smallness. I want to tell you something that took me a long time to fully believe. The verdict that was delivered about you was not about you. It was about the person delivering it. It was about what your unwillingness to shrink represented to them. It was about the specific threat that an autonomous, capable refusal to be managed human being poses to a person whose power depends on the people around them remaining dependent. Your father, your mother, your sister, your brother. Whoever it was who looked at the thing you were becoming and decided that the correct response was rejection or punishment, or the removal of resources, they were not responding to a real assessment of your value. They were responding to a threat to their control. The painful irony is that the rejection itself becomes the education. The absence of a safety net forces the development of the capacity to build one. The withdrawal of support accelerates the discovery of self-reliance. The people who tried to bury you were, without knowing or intending it, selecting you for the most rigorous possible training in the only skills that ultimately matter. Not because suffering is ennobling, it is not inherently, it is simply suffering, and it costs real things, and it leaves marks that do not fully go away. But the human response to genuine adversity, when it does not break the person entirely, is often the development of a kind of structural integrity that cannot be acquired any other way. A knowledge of one's own load-bearing capacity that can only be discovered by being placed under actual load. I was placed under load early and without consent, and it was not fair, and I would not choose it retrospectively. But I also know that the woman who stood in that Fifth Avenue lobby with the deed to the building in her jacket pocket and watched her father's credit card decline in front of the reception desk was made in significant part by exactly those years of load, by the cold studio apartment and the 3 jobs and the scholarship applications and the sleepless cash flow calculations and the first collection in the basement gallery and every subsequent choice to continue rather than concede. They tried to make me small, and instead they accidentally made me immovable. If you have been cast out by the people who were supposed to hold you, I want you to know that the casting out is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the chapter where you find out what you are actually made of. And what you are made of, I promise you, is more than they told you. Build the thing, own the building, change the locks. Your success is not just an outcome, it is the answer to a question they never intended to ask. Vivienne's story illuminates one of the most difficult truths about toxic family systems. The people who benefit most from your dependence will always reframe your independence as a betrayal. Douglas did not arrive at Noir Eclat that evening because he loved his daughter. He arrived because the structures he had used to maintain his position in the world were quietly failing, and he had identified her success as a resource he believed he was entitled to extract. The most striking element of Vivian's response was not the legal precision or the strategic preparation, though both were formidable. It was the fundamental groundedness from which she operated throughout the confrontation. She was not performing calm. She was not suppressing anger. She had done the interior work, the therapy, the years of deliberate reconstruction of her own self-conception to arrive at a place where her father's assessment of her held no operative power over her decisions. That is the work that cannot be shortcut and cannot be faked. The external architecture, the brand, the building, the holding company, these were the visible expression of an interior architecture that had been built first. And it is that interior structure that ultimately made the difference. Not because it was impenetrable to pain, but because it was stable enough to remain functional in the presence of pain. If you are currently in the early stages of that interior construction, if you are the person in the cold apartment with the cash flow spreadsheet and the borrowed studio space and the people who told you that you were asking too much, I want you to know that what you are doing right now, the act of continuing anyway, is the most important work you will ever do. Keep building. The building is the proof. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below and tell us where you are in your own story. Subscribe for more, and remember, the people who underestimate you are doing you the most useful favor of your life.